Hi, this is the 41st episode of the Prostate Cancer Lab. We're coming up on almost 1 year, albeit, like 50 plus. As usual, I'm going to start us off with the legal disclaimer. Please note that the information and opinions shared on this website or platform or during discussions and presentations are not intended as medical advice. It is important to consult with a healthcare professional about your specific situation before making any decisions related to your health. And like the Miranda, what's that? The Miranda rights, like this can and will be used in a public setting. Anything you can't say. So if you don't want to be quoted, if you don't want to be public, don't say anything. If you don't want to be visual on the video recording, keep your video turned off, and those are the protections we provide, but otherwise everything can and will be made public. Today we're honored to have Susan Bratton with us. I've known Susan for a while. We've talked about nutrition and health. I've got a personal pet peeve around personalization and nutrition. Like, why is it that we can't, if I'm taking chemo, why can't I get this diet that's tailored to chemo? Or if I've got follicular lymphoma, which I have, then aren't there some things that are better for that person than others? That's been a question of mine, and in the course of doing that, I ran into Susan and her work at Savor Health. I think sure we're all going to learn a lot today. We've had several sessions on nutrition, different angles. Right, we had the patient session that Robert and Glenn Sabin led. We had the filtracine presentation on a scientific approach that they're using to have a very restricted diet of amino acids, very scientific. And then last week we had Nigel Bratton talking from the American Institute of Cancer Research about what's evidence-based around nutrition. So Susan's going to give us something that's going to be, I think, complementary to all of that. I think it's a different point of view that you'll find useful and builds on some of the other conversations we've had. So with that, I'll turn it over to Susan.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I'm excited to have this conversation, and I will attempt to share my screen. See if I can figure that one out. In this world of Zoom, we should all be able to do that now, right?
That's working.
It's working. Okay, great. So first of all, thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to talk to you and answer your questions. And as I said to Brad earlier this morning, I'm not a dietitian. So to the extent the questions extend my knowledge, what I will do is follow up with our dietitians, and I can go offline with you. But I'm as part of our scientific approach and not getting too far out over our skis, I think it's really important to be, forthright about what I do know and what I don't know. And I think what you'll find is that my approach and our approach is very much that way. If we know something and it's validated in the literature, then we feel comfortable. If we don't, then we're going to, kind of take a wait and see approach rather. And so with that, questions that get deep into the nitty gritty of nutrition and the science, I'm probably not the best person to answer them. To the extent I can, I will though. So my story begins about 13 years ago. Actually, it goes further back than that. I became a vegetarian when I was a freshman in college, and I took a class called Biology of the Cancer Cell. And that was a long time ago. And it was when in animal models, the research was showing that red meats and heterocyclamines were correlated with colon cancer, the development of colon cancer in animal models. And I decided as a freshman in college that I was going to become a vegetarian as a result. So fast forward to about 13 years ago, I lost a really close friend to a glioblastoma, so a deadly form of a brain tumor. And I was struck by the fact that my friend was told nutrition doesn't matter, eat whatever you want. And I thought, wow, that makes no sense at all to me. I believe nutrition matters. I'm a vegetarian, and I don't think everybody has to be a vegetarian, by the way. But I approached this problem from the perspective of nutrition should matter, but I was also a healthcare finance person. So I knew that evidence was how medicine was practiced. And so I did a deep dive into the literature. And what I found was that nutrition matters, and it matters a lot in cancer care. And so I built a company and a technology. We're a digital health company that provides precision nutrition interventions to manage the symptoms of cancer and cancer treatment. And we do that, and I'll get into this in a minute, through a virtual dietitian on demand. But when you kind of step back at 30,000 feet and say, what do you want to grow? What do you want to be when you grow up? And what do you want your company to be when you grow up? Is my mission is that evidence-based nutrition becomes standard of care, incorporated into treatment guidelines. So when you're diagnosed with cancer, in addition to whatever therapy you're getting, chemo, radiation, surgery, all of the above, immunotherapy, in addition to the treatment regimen that your physician prescribes, you're also prescribed a nutrition intervention that is designed to be complementary and additive to the therapy, the treatment that you're undergoing. And in order to get from here to there, takes a very scientific, kind of data-driven, rigorous approach, much like a pharma company would take in getting a small molecule through the FDA approval process to get onto the market. And so we're all about science, we're all about evidence, and that's how we approach this problem. Part of what I found was that 100% of cancer patients experience symptoms. Only 10% of patients are voluntarily reporting those symptoms. And we know that the symptoms lead to things like dose reduction, treatment suspension, terrible quality of life, and also an increase in costs. So ER visits, inpatient admissions. One of the things I found was that 58% of Medicare patients on chemo visit the ER annually. And of those, 63% are subsequently admitted to the hospital at an average cost. And this is kind of, this data is a bit old, $22,000. I bet it's more like 30,000 today. But the point is, I looked at it from my healthcare finance perspective and said, wow, everybody wins. This is a huge unmet need. There's data that shows everyone in the healthcare delivery system would benefit if we use nutrition as interventional lever. So what's the problem? And the problem is there's only one dietitian for every 2,700 cancer patients. And the vast majority of those are in the 71 NCI designated cancer centers, where only 30% of patients are treated. So the remaining 70% are treated in the community cancer setting, where there are few, if any, nutrition resources. The other kind of overlay here, I would say, is there's a lot of misinformation out there about nutrition and cancer care, and I think that complicates the problem a bit. I didn't include in this presentation, but I'm happy to share it with you, the literature that I found that demonstrates nutrition as an interventional lever can delay time to onset and reduce frequency, severity, duration of symptoms. There are multiple studies out there. There's a lot of research. Happy to share that with you. I thought for this, I wasn't going to dive into those details. I also found that the current solutions in the market really aren't effective. The first is it's really an analog system. There's not enough supply of dietitians to meet the demand.
Okay, I don't care.
The second thing is they're not really, there's a lot of misinformation, non-scientific stuff out there, quacks, for lack of a better word, that are promising false cure and oftentimes having patients do things that are detrimental to their treatment. And lastly, to your point, Brad, they really lack personalization, either clinical or contextual. And by that, I mean, there are a lot of nutrition companies in the market today, but they, here's a diabetes friendly recipe. There aren't a lot in cancer, by the way, but recipes that can be sorted by meal occasion or cultural ethnic preferences, but really, other than kind of single variable personalization, they're not really targeted to help people not only with their clinical need, but also how do you want to eat? So what we've developed is a virtual dietitian on demand that provides 24/7 oncology credentialed registered dietitian level support and guidance. So we're using AI and expert system to create supply of dietitians, very, very targeted to the patient's needs. So we personalize based on the clinical needs. So we're looking at the primary cancer diagnosis, the treatment regimen, the symptoms that patients are experiencing, underlying comorbidities, medications, height, weight for a BMI, but also weight history. So really not just solving for the cancer type and the treatment and the symptoms, but also the underlying clinical profile of the patient. You can't be a precision nutrition company if you're not also solving for what are the guidelines for a hypertensive patient or a diabetic patient. And then we also personalize on context. And to me, context really is the patient's experiences lived by in their own environment. So we're looking at eating preferences, food allergies, ethnic, religious preferences, and also things like food insecurity and other social determinants. But the goal here is to meet people where they are. And I hate to use that because it's overused, but not just the clinical need, but also what do you want to eat and what do you eat within your own kind of environment. Everything in our platform is based on evidence. It's fully referenced and cited from tier 1 peer-reviewed journals and or treatment guidelines. So it's all about science. It's delivered via the cell phone, so 24/7 on demand, a texting with our platform and our virtual dietitian named Ina. And we've designed it to be super easy. So the goal is let's engage with simplicity. So how it works is this expert system that's designed to replicate the logic and knowledge of dietitians. So on one hand, we have the intake form, which you go to a landing page, you enter your mobile phone number, you accept terms and conditions, and you receive an initial survey, which contains branching logic and expert rules. It's really that kind of next question that a dietitian would do if you were sitting in front of them in their office, designed to get the profile, the baseline profile of the patient from which we can provide personalization. But as a step in that, we provide virtual triage nurse functionality. And the purpose of that is to really ascertain whether or not the patient is appropriate for a dietitian, be it in-person, teledietitian, or our virtual dietitian on demand. It could be that the symptom severity is such that they really need to go to their medical provider, in which case we triage them to the medical provider. If they get through that first gate, then we're on to the virtual dietitian. So we've now got the intake form. On the other side, we have this expert database, which today is over 75,000 interventions, all of which, as I mentioned, fully referenced and cited from tier 1 peer-reviewed journals. And then in the middle, just like a dietitian's brain, we have matching algorithms that take that patient use cases defined by these variables and extracts from the database, both based on clinical and contextual information, the most appropriate intervention for the patient at that point in time. It's all guidelines based. So it could be recipes, it's query response and push guidance. So it could be, Ina, I need a recipe that won't irritate my mouth sores, or Ina, I need foods that what are the foods I need to avoid if I have mouth sores? But it's guidelines based. We also do push guidance. So once we learn that the patient might be having mouth sores or diarrhea, then we're going to start pushing guidance to them based on their symptom profile to help remind them that Ina is there and to provide them with additional support and guidance. We try to have that be kind of low burden and not overwhelming to the patient, because we know patients are super overwhelmed. We update our symptom profile on a weekly basis because we know that the symptom trajectory, both the presence of symptoms and the severity of the symptoms, can change pretty rapidly. And in the back end of the platform, we've got feedback loops and machine learning that enable us to be more and more personalized to the patient level, what works for them specifically, but also as their symptoms change, their treatment changes, anything else changes, we're able to stay up to date on that so that we can be most appropriate to them. The platform has been translated into Spanish, but it's not yet launched in Spanish. And the reason for that comes back to context. And it is that we know that we don't know, but we don't know what we don't know. And by that, I mean, we have had 2 native Spanish speakers translate the platform, but we want to user test it in the very diverse Hispanic population within the United States so that we can identify things that we haven't solved for in the platform and then update. We've got great results, and I think as patients and caregivers here, I think there is no better measure of, are we helping people, by the high levels of engagement and satisfaction. And the point here is just, we really have tried to make this as low burden as possible so that we can help people and not overwhelm them. And then last but not least, we've worked with all of the companies on this platform, multiple multi-year assignments. And the point of this is just back to kind of science evidence. We're a super legitimate science-based organization. And as a result, we've been really fortunate to work with all these organizations. We've done a lot of clinical research with MD Anderson, and we're getting ready to do some research with some other partners as well. Now I'm going to stop there and hand it over to questions. Oh, I see there's something in the chat. That's probably Brad telling me to wrap it up.
No,
Oh no, it's
no,
Rick Stanton
no.
saying, can the folks on this try it out? Is it expensive? How does INA's recommendations compare with expert dietitians? Okay. Yes, I will give you guys a link. You can all sign up for it. And feel free to tell me what you like, what you dislike. We're only as good as the feedback that people give us, and I don't take anything personally. I want to make this as user-friendly and as impactful as possible. So as I always say to my team, if somebody says they don't like something about it, thank them. That's the best thing that we can do, is listen. Because it's not the people telling us it's great that makes us better. It's the people that's telling us we aren't doing something great. That's how we get better. Is it expensive? No, it's free to patients. So it's paid for by pharma companies, by the health insurance companies. We provide this for free to patients. We provide it for free to all the advocacy groups. We work with them. And the point of that is just, we want this to be in the hands of patients so we can help more people. We're not going to charge patients for it ever. The payers can pay for it. The pharma can pay for it. They have money. How does it compare with our expert dietitians? It's built by our dietitians, so it compares perfectly, 100%. But it's a great question in that, and we've been talking to some data science people about validation and having these conversations about exactly that. And so what we want to do is do validation outside. So with some of the cancer centers that we're partnering with, to confirm that that the high level of kind of accuracy is validated in other dietitians. I expect that it will be, because again, this is all guidelines based, so it should be. We have about 4,000 patients on the platform right now. I'm looking at the AI architecture. Yeah, so about 4,000. How many input points per patient is that? So the question on that is, do you mean how many data points are we capturing on a per patient basis, or how much data do we have in total? Because we have what you might imagine are the high engagers, and then we have the low engagers. So it really depends.
Well, really? Well, where I was coming from was the first question. So reeling back in time, I asked, how does INA's compare with your expert dietitians? Of course, I would expect congruence. But then you notice my next question to cue that up was with outside dietitians. And so that comes from a system validation point of view.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned you're doing well, or you're in progress, or you're probably leading the pack because you're basing your recommendations on peer-reviewed literature.
Yeah.
So I was trying to get a sense of your validation.
Yeah. Okay.
You'll notice that the next set of questions is, what is your architecture? And whenever people give us a talk and they say we're AI driven, nobody knows their architecture. There's many AI algorithms, there's many approaches. You did mention feedback loops. So there's a lot of ways that could play out So do you
Yeah.
know your AI archecture, or is
Um,
it
well,
Just
on the-
interject, Susan, so you understand where Rick's coming from. He's a bioinformatician, in case you didn't notice.
No, but I definitely want to have an offline call with Rick after this. So to answer your question, on the front end, it's NLP, right? So the NLP is kind of helping us with the matching. On the back end, and I may not be able to answer the actual architecture question. I can tell you that we're built on kind of AWS, if that's helpful. The feedback loops and machine learning is really kind of for three primary reasons, or two. The first of which is continuing to enhance and refine to the user, right? Because everybody has a different experience. Certain things work for certain people, certain things don't work for other people. And our goal is to be as personalized as we can to you, the patient. And for example, think about the Uber 5-star rating. How was that recipe? Oh, it was a 1. Okay, why? Oh, well, it had garlic in it. Okay, well, on your intake, you didn't tell us that you don't like garlic. Maybe you had a change in taste. So that's something that now next recipe is not going to include garlic. When you get to kind of large, so at 4,000 patients, machine learning isn't doing a lot of machine learning, as you know, right? We need to get to large, I mean, it is learning, but the end goal, if you step back to my mission, we need, and this is why we're going to the payers in particular, because they're aggregators of patients, because ultimately my belief is that when you stratify light cohorts of patients, you're going to find signals in that data, those correlations, and those become what we then go to the next level of validation. So today, it's kind of like a real world clinical trial, right? We're taking the evidence as it is today, we're gathering the data, and my belief is nutrition science is going to get moved much further along now because of the power and the strength of computing and the ability to process all this data. So in the future, now we're going to be able to see that patients on, the PD-1s, anti-PD-1s that eat broccoli and have hypertension and a BMI of 35 do better on the broccoli, whereas these other patients do better on cauliflower. That's just an example, but I believe that's where this platform ultimately goes to answer your question about the learning and the validation. That's the end goal. We are not even close to that right now. Our goal today is to be as personalized to the patient in managing their symptoms for the best outcomes, both clinically and quality of life, and to gather the data that ultimately enables us to dive deeper and to find those correlations. And for example, right, the microbiome and the immunotherapies, right? We're going to understand. I mean, there's already studies, and we've done some with MD Anderson about what you eat and its impact on your immune system and response to immunotherapy. I mean, that's a great example of how this plays out down the road. I don't know if that's answering your question. I'm kind of getting into the long-term vision, but as a sciencey, math geeky type of a person, that's where I want this to go. But in the meantime, our first priority is to help patients manage their symptoms so they can stay on therapy, they can do better, feel better, all of that. I mean, that's the most important priority right now. And then within that, we're going to gather the data so that we can dive deeper and really understand from a mechanistic perspective, like in the drug development, what is the mechanism of action? Are we upregulating something, downregulating something? And why within one person does this happen and not in another? That's the end goal. Make sense?
Yes, it's a wonderful goal. I applaud you, and I want to try out your system. I think you're on to something. It also tells me you don't know your AI architecture, but that's okay. No,
I don't. I can have my AI guys help
nobody
me.
does. It's like this. Don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain kind of thing. So that's fine. But I like you, and I want to try out your stuff. And the questions about the data points and how many, I'm looking at it from an AI perspective, just to see the maturity of your AI capabilities, and I can see them now after your discussion.
Yeah,
See
I'd
a bit
say
more
as
where you are and where you're going. And
I
it's
would say if I'm a baseball fan, so we're in the first inning of a game that goes extra innings. That's where we are.
okay, that's
Yeah.
great. And I like the game. I think it's brilliant.
Crawl, walk, run. There's a lot of things we want to do. And, I think we kind of have to keep our eye on the ball in terms of helping patients, but we also have to know where we're going and work backwards and have that plan for, where we go and what the data points are and how we get there. And, talking to smart people like you that are in this business is great, because I am not, as you can tell, I'm neither a coder or a data scientist. I just work with a lot of them. So that's the future of this company for sure.
Okay, there are questions teed up from Eric, Brian, and Carla. Let me ask that since they're on, let's hear them give voice to them. So rather than you just reading them, let's ask Eric. Can you kind of give your question by voice?
Yeah, I think my question's kind of similar to Carla, but I'll let her confirm that, I guess. So I guess I'm kind of wondering what it looks like more from the patient experience. Like what inputs do you take from us? Are there certain, is there a patient goal maybe taken into account as far as what the recommendations might be? And I guess I'm also wondering, you mentioned it as guidelines based. Are those FDA guidelines? Is that what you mean, or what guidelines do
No,
you mean?
they're the oncology nutrition, the ONDPG, so the Oncology Nutrition and Dietetics Practice Group, which is part of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. They align, you mentioned the AIC, they're very much in align with the AICR guidelines, which are more around prevention, but they're also, a lot of that's very applicable to during treatment. So those are the guidelines. We're focused primarily on a couple of things. So one is nutrition for symptom self-management. So it's using nutrition as an interventional lever to kind of reduce the frequency, severity, and duration of the symptoms. It's better. And let me move. Hang on a second. Let me see if this works. Here we go. Let me sit on the floor. Getting sun in my eyes. And so it's really about what are the symptoms you're experiencing, making sure that there are, for example, no contraindicated foods with respect to either your underlying comorbidities, certain medications you're on, either chemo or otherwise. And the intake is the initial intake is cancer diagnosis, staging, treatment regimen at that point in time, side effects at that point in time, underlying comorbidities, height, weight, which will calculate a BMI, and then weight history. That's the initial intake. And then when a patient says, give me can I have a recipe for, that will trigger an outreach form that then seeks to intake eating preferences and food allergies. So to answer your question about food allergies, we don't have specific patient goals in there today. And it's something that we've talked about. And we're trying to figure out how we do this in a way that still ensures that we're using nutrition as an interventional lever to manage the symptoms, and that those goals, that there's no conflict in the goals, because there could be. So that's where we are with that. I'm kind of, not FDA. And then the other thing about the recommendations are they're also based on what the patient is asking. So it could be a recipe, it could be foods to avoid, foods to eat, really, what is the query that's coming from the patient? Does that answer your question, Eric? Excuse me.
Yeah, I think that's a good start. I heard you talk a lot about symptom or side effect management, right? That seems
Yeah.
like a core piece of it, along with allergies and food choice or food
It-
preference, I should say.
It is, and it is because the state of evidence today is strongest in kind of nutrition as interventional lever for symptom management. When we start to get into kind of different diet types and things like that, there's great research happening, for example, with the ketogenic diet and brain cancer. And it's a balance, right? Because there's some really good findings, but they may not reach the point where we're going to put them in the platform, because we want to make sure that that's far enough along that it would be adopted kind of standard of care. And I know that sometimes doesn't make people happy, but I'm really playing the long game here. And I think the minute that we start to put into this platform things that may be considered a little bit further out and exploratory, we lose our ability to help more patients, because we will get resistance in the medical community. And it's a balance, because I can tell you right now, there are some things I believe in that aren't in the platform. And it's a delicate balance.
Last question then,
Okay.
is there any input, like, of a person, like if I said I want foods that have been shown to have like an anti-cancer effect, I know there's some research around mushrooms, for example,
Yeah.
like saying what foods have anti-cancer effect that I could eat, right?
Right. And so then the question becomes, okay, what's your definition of anti-cancer, right? Because then you start to have, well, who's saying it's anti-cancer?
Mhm.
You could have, there are people so you could look at things like blueberries and resveratrol and the mushroom studies, which are, in Japan, the evidence is solid, right? In breast
Right.
cancer, they've done loads of studies there, less adopted in the United States. What we try to do is work with where the guidelines are and recommend the foods that are accepted as anti-cancer and supportive, and which will help you manage your symptoms and won't irritate your symptoms. So there are certain anti-cancer foods that might irritate a symptom like diarrhea, right? Great from an anti-cancer perspective, but could exacerbate the diarrhea. So there's that balance.
Okay, thank you.
And that's what a dietitian would do, by the way, right? Okay, are you integrated?
Let's do Brian next, and if Brian, if you could voice your question.
Yeah, I think this is kind of related to inputs and like how the model is learning, right? But as this is a journey for cancer patients, and how are you integrating updated electronic medical record information to account for changes in therapy, symptoms, et cetera, right? Because as advanced cancer patients, we're sort of like marching through various treatments that can create genomic alterations. There's a whole host of things that happen, as survivorship for cancer patients grows longer because of more effective medicines.
Right. No, great question. So today our data points are all patient reported, and patient reported symptom presence and severity, and that's updated on a weekly basis. Similarly, we do a monthly outreach on treatment regimen, like if the treatment has changed. We also ask the patient, if it changes in between that month-long period, let us know. But there's a whole kind of data roadmap that we have, and EMR is top of the list. We just signed a partnership with a company called Apricity Care, which is a couple of people out of MD Anderson, Jim Allison being one, the guy who invented immunotherapy, and a geneticist named Linda Chin. And they are to oncologists what we are to oncology dietitians, meaning they're an extension of the practice with a focus on symptom management. They have already built the EMR integration. So in our partnership with them, which launches on the 1st of March, we will then have that EHR data. So as relates to our work with them, we're going to have, and so we're bringing them into all these things that we're doing in oncology, and we'll have that data. So that's an important piece of the roadmap.
Is that just for MD Anderson patients?
No, it's not. It's actually
Okay.
not for MD Anderson patients at
Okay.
all.
Okay.
It's
So it's a nationwide.
they're
Okay.
focusing more on self-insured employers, health systems, and payers
Okay.
as
Great.
a distribution, right? So as a
Yeah.
way to support the patients.
That's helpful. And I'm just and I would imagine that it will update. It's not just a one-time, integration of this data. It's okay.
Yeah, and so if you think about the two-way data flow that happens with the EHR, the SOAP notes that are going in, data's coming back to us, so that kind of continual update as things change.
Interesting. Yeah, there's potentially an opportunity for you to integrate your insights back into the hospital so that they can help adoption of your platform. I'm sure you've already thought about that.
Well, and with Apricity, we're doing that. So
Okay.
when we launch, all of the kind of the SOAP notes, all of the things, not only the data that we're capturing, kind of that PRO data, but also, Symptom presents with mouth sores, severity 4, dietitian, this is what we told them to do. That all goes into the EHR. So it's a great, to your point, it's a great reinforcement. Now the oncologist is looking at it and saying, oh, okay.
Yeah. Awesome. Exciting.
Yeah. Crawl, walk, run. There's so many things I want to do.
Next question is from Richard Anders. What do you have, Richard?
I think some of this got answered. First, I just want to say, I'm sorry I came in late, but I have, my parents were book publishers who published, among many other things, cookbooks. And I have been around and loved food really like as long as I remember. And as I've gotten more embroiled in the medical field, I've come to feel that there's an awful lot of drug-like characteristics to food. And I've sort of had ideas, I think, somewhat similar to what you've been implementing. I've just thought about it. You've done it. So I think this is really great. I think that you've sort of answered my question in the last few minutes, just about what data you're collecting. But I'm curious about the EHR. So what do? You say to a patient, give us some kind of connection to the EHR and we'll tap into it? Is that, how is that actually done?
Yeah, how is it? So what, and it's not happening until the 1st of March with Apricity, but there will be, there's consent. And the patient will consent to the EHR data and access. So that's how it's done. So Apricity is in charge of actually so they've kind of built the integration into the EHR to capture that data and the consent, and then we have access to it as essentially a partner or subcontractor.
So their model is they make a deal with a hospital. I mean, if someone is not involved, if Apricity is not connected to a given hospital, you can't get the data from that hospital, I guess.
No, they go direct to the oncologist. So they're an extension of the oncologist. So they go direct to the oncologist and interface with them, and the patient consents to the data transfer.
So does the patient have the right to tap into the EHR as a matter of patient rights? Or is it that the company needs to have a deal with the oncologist in order to allow that to happen? I mean, as a patient, you could, of course, say, I want my medical records, and they're duty bound to give it to you, but I don't know if they're duty bound to give it to you by tapping into the record.
Yeah. So, so there are a couple of different scenarios. So scenario 1 is patient consents, Apricity goes to the provider, they get access to the EHR. If the patient wants access to their own EHR, right now we're not facilitating that. I mean, I think that's something that it's an interesting question. Usually it comes from the provider like us going out and working with the middleware companies that they could say, yeah, you can have access. We're not doing that. That was actually how we were going to do it, is we were going down the path with a specific company. we would get the consent and then integrate into whether it's an Epic or a Cerner and pull the data down. With Apricity, we don't have to do that. So we've kind of changed course there. There's another angle. So there are these health information exchanges where a physician can say, for medical necessity, I have to have access to this data, and you don't have to get patient consent. I don't like that model because I always think patients should be in charge of their data. You actually can do it. I mean, you can go to the HIEs and pull down all sorts of data on patients if a physician says it's medically necessary. But I don't like that way because I think it goes around the patient. I really don't want to do that.
I mean, it would be surprising to me, actually, if you could get that necessity claim attached to what you're doing from the clinician point of view. But if you do tap in, then the next set of questions, which I guess we shouldn't get into now, is how you understand the medical record. Maybe Apricity has a bunch of tools to understand it, but things like labs and biomarkers, that would be very useful. Things like symptom description would be useful, but those are harder to get. I mean, labs are sort of more relatively easy to parse, but other stuff, a lot of physicians do that in a lot of different ways. But it sounds like your vision is you want to get all of that eventually and have a running stream of what the patient's biomarkers, what the patient's symptoms are, everything that they've got, and then from the patient, the self-reported what they're eating. And what
so the patients are self-reporting symptoms because the medical record generally is not, it's only captured every 4 to 5 weeks when the patient comes in. It's not done in a manner that really, we're getting it on a Likert scale of 1 to 5. On a scale of 1 to 5, what is it? In the medical record, the physician may say, patient says they've been throwing up for the last 5 weeks, right? That's about as good as it's going to be. We're going to get more granular data and the kind of the severity level of that data. So I think our PRO data, I mean, yes, it's patient reported, but I think that's probably a more accurate marker of a symptom. When relates to things like labs, therein, I mean, we can now look at things like, for example, the PI3 kinase inhibitors, cause metabolic syndrome. So now if we're capturing A1C, we can now see when INA intervenes, is the A1C leveling out at 5 or 6, or did it spike up to a 7 or an 8, right? Okay, well, that's a great measure of, are we doing our job or not? So I like that a lot. And I think also as you think about the underlying comorbidities, all those lab data, when you think about, I'm using A1C as a for example, but there are many other markers of inflammation, C-reactive protein, all sorts of things that we can then incorporate into our rules engine that right now we're not able to do. And so it can become both an endpoint, a measure of validation. Yes, we're moderating the A1C. But it can also become a variable in an algorithm, a personalization algorithm, that now we're looking at level of A1C, level of inflammation, things like that could help us be more targeted in what we're recommending, right? If we know certain foods are inflammatory, which we shouldn't be recommending anyway, but I'm just as a for example, right?
I mean, you could also construct probably trials and virtual trials. That would be really interesting. You could say, we're doing a trial on this. You could probably go out to a network of oncologists if you got them and maybe get them to ask for certain labs to be part of a virtual trial. It's really interesting.
And we're doing that. We're pulling, we're doing that with MD Anderson. We had a great phase 4 clinical trial ready to go. We were beginning to enroll patients with Novartis, and COVID hit, killed the pilot. And then the person that was kind of heading this whole thing left the company, and that's how those things go. But it's interesting because now MD Anderson was doing another, not MD Anderson, Sloan was doing another study with them, in a feeding study, Novartis, and they've now come to us and said, wow, we think INA would be a really good addition for the next version of this study. So from his mouth to God's words, but God's lips. But anyway, we're we're going down the path with that one.
Really interesting.
Yeah, and we're also in some of our payer conversations, we're also looking at these validation studies within specific patient, specific cancer types. Because we know that ultimately we've got to validate and quantify both kind of clinical impact, but also quantification of ROI, because that becomes the rate limiting factor in adoption. And adoption is important to building data, which is important to building kind of the long game of what are those precision nutrition interventions for those subgroups of patients. So validation is a big priority.
You're probably going to have a very weak signal that will take a long time to discern, unless you're doing some very focused trials with extremely high clinical payback. But you'll figure it all out, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of one of the overlays that we have to incorporate into which cancers, which treatment types, because you have to have, I mean, I think about everything from an efficiency perspective, right? What's the low hanging fruit? Where can we get really solid validation? Because it's kind of like earning the right to next, right? So we got to focus on the ones where we can validate and quantify, and there's just a high degree of a high probability of success. Because
symptoms is probably the easiest. Oh, you got mouth sores. This makes the patient feel better. Those are fairly low hanging fruit, I guess. But
well, those were validating, but I want the clinical right. I want some of these biomarkers and some of that, because that's where it gets super exciting. I mean,
raising neutrophil counts, that could be hard.
Right. Yeah, well, and attribution. So now we're getting into a whole, right? So why is it that those numbers move one way or the other? I mean, that's also a complicating factor.
Susan, let me ask a question which we may not be able to answer, maybe an unfair question, but since we have advanced prostate cancer patients here, do you have any, as you were mentioning, sort of special subtypes of your 4,000 patients? How many are advanced prostate cancer patients? And since prostate cancer patients are often on androgen deprivation therapy, is there anything around hormone, people on hormone reducing drugs like women with breast cancer as well? Anything in that sphere that's sort of specific to this cancer type?
Yeah. So in terms of the number of prostate cancer, it's number 5 in our kind of breakdown. Breast cancer is first, lung is second. I'm trying to remember the other two, but it's number 5 in terms of number of patients. In terms of the kind of hormonally based cancers, and the literature, and what I can do is follow up with some specific studies, but the literature that we've seen is really focused on lowering inflammation, and it seems so obvious, right? Anti-inflammatory foods, and depending on where the patient is, kind of from a trajectory perspective, oftentimes weight loss is important because of the symptoms that develop, and we see weight gain in these patients, and so managing that weight, because weight gain is correlated with recurrence and inferior outcomes, and so managing weight and really focusing on low inflammatory foods is important for this patient population.
That's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? We're coming in right in. Go, Brian.
Mm-hmm.
You're on mute, Brian.
Gosh, my intro was amazing too.
Damn. Take 2.
So we had a person from AICR on last week. Really fascinating information that came from that. But we got on this whole thing around exercise, and we talked a lot about how biometrics are so important, in terms of capturing, information, but it's difficult to be able to ingest that information. Obviously, when you think about diet, it's like diet and exercise. They kind of, it's a perfect handshake.
Yep.
And so I'm just curious how you're thinking about integrating exercise into your model. And if you're thinking about, integrating wearable information into, one of your data sets. It's critical. It's the one thing, the things that cancer patients can control. There's basically two things. It's diet and it's exercise.
Yep.
And so I probably focus more of my time on exercise than I do on diet, quite frankly. I thought I've always had a fairly healthy diet, but yeah, just curious about, how you're thinking about exercise in this model.
Yeah. So in terms of our data roadmap, wearables is an absolute yes. It's not an if, it's a when. And so the EHR has been the priority over the wearables. But when you think about hormonally based cancers, inflammation, weight gain, weight loss, any sort of metabolic syndrome, those wearables become very important. So the short answer is yes. EHR was ahead of that, but that's kind of the next version. And we're also going beyond. We just finished something with United Healthcare in type 2 diabetes. And so, diabetes, heart disease, they're all underlying comorbidities of many cancer patients. And they're now kind of new therapeutic verticals for us, all of which require these wearables and the wearable data to really be impactful. So yes.
Awesome.
Exercise. Again, I completely agree with you. Exercise and nutrition go hand in glove. They are very important together. We haven't, this is a long conversation, but we're trying to figure out what to do with exercise. It matters a lot, but as a company, we haven't found anybody that does exercise like I'd like to partner, to be honest with you, because we're kind of nutrition, all nutrition all the time, but we may have to, and it wouldn't be hard on our platform to build out the exercise. It's just a matter of focus and in a perfect world, what I'd like to do is partner with someone. The reality of it is we probably are going to have to build it on our platform, because I've looked out there and I'm just not finding anything that that meets our kind of standard of evidence and rigor. I don't want just, XYZ personal trainer. That's not where we're going. The literature is really strong on exercise. So it's a no-brainer. So it's just, how are we going to do it?
Yeah, I'll just add one bit of context to that. The longer a advanced prostate cancer patient is on hormone therapy, there's no testosterone, right? Testosterone is critical for maintaining muscular health. Well, the heart is a muscle, and so cardiovascular disease becomes a real issue for exactly. So, and I think that's true for breast cancer as well. So as you mentioned, like hormone-based diseases, but anyway.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why cardio is I brought on an interventional cardiologist as our chief medical officer to work with us on that, because it is so prevalent. And if you guys know of any exercise company that you think is legit, we found one in Norwalk, Connecticut, but they're no longer around. But they were doing some interesting things, but they're not around anymore, which is too bad. And then there was the STAR program, Julie Silver at Harvard, but that's kind of been absorbed into something else. Intermittent fasting. Okay, that's a long. Walter Longo is an amazing person, and he's done a lot of that research. We're still watching it, but I think it has, his research is really good. But again, to me, it falls into the category of, we're going to watch it. I mean, it really needs to be done under the supervision of a physician. And so for us to do it appropriately and safely, we would have to be much more integrated with the physician to do it because it requires that. Time of exercise after eating, glucose spike reduction hit. We haven't been doing any of that right now, but it's all something that we need to be doing, especially when we integrate exercise. Okay. Peter Attia, I love him. Fantastic. He's great. Yeah.
There's a program called Limitless that just came out with Chris Hemsworth.
Yep.
Where he's doing all this crazy stuff. It's fascinating. And one of the episodes is around fasting, and of course, Peter is his guide through that whole process. So if you haven't seen it, it's great.
You know what? It's on my list to watch because I do think it's super interesting. But speaking of software architecture, I'm hopping on a call with our software architect right now. But thank you all. If there's Brad, you can give them my email and we'll get you guys all access to the platform. And, you know, I'm all ears. If there are things you think we need to be doing, things we can do better, areas you think we should look into, you know, just drop me a line because this is, you know, this is a community and we're only as good as all of you, of everybody helping each other and guiding. We can't know everything, so we have to rely on other people's wisdom and expertise.
Thank you, Susan. We have the same philosophy. And so I'm sure we will be following up. We're also early adopters. And so I'm sure there will be people reaching out to kick the tires on your services, and we'll be giving you feedback.
Okay, that's great. Thank